Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club, we're featuring The Inner Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. It's a
Our book today.
Just wanted to let you know that the hearings right now are on pause, and we will break back in with you as soon as they start. So enjoy the book report. Austria, 16 December 1944. Improve everyone's well-being. This is in Chapter 6, The Misconception of Meritocracy, page 161. Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London who became Foreign Secretary in Theresa May's Conservative government in 2016, was educated at Eton and Oxford. Giving the Margaret Thatcher lecture to a think tank in 2013, he articulated the view that economic equality will never be possible because some people are simply too stupid to catch up with the rest of society. Quote, whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, he said. Comparing society to a box of cornflakes, he praised inequality for creating the conditions under which the brightest triumph. Quote, the harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top, end quote. Inequality, quote, is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses that is, like greed, a valuable spur to economic activity. Whether or not Johnson is quite as clever a cornflake as he presumably likes to think, he certainly is not in command of the facts. Nobel Prize-winning economists, as well as the OECD and IMF, have shown how inequality, far from spurring on economic growth, leads to stagnation and instability. Social mobility is reduced where income inequality is greatest, and far from inspiring innovation, it turns out that there are actually slightly more patents granted per head of population in more equal countries. And as we've seen in the previous chapters, there's also the undeniable human cost of our fixation with keeping up with the Joneses. But Boris is far from alone in his misconceptions about the relationships between inequality and ability. The idea that people are naturally endowed with differences in ability, intelligence, or talent, and that those differences then determine how far up the social ladder they reach, is a powerful popular justification for social hierarchy. The presumption is that we live in a meritocracy in which the key to status is ability. We think of society as shaped like a pyramid. The supposition is that most people are near the bottom or only a little above it because the bulk of the population lack the special talents that we imagine people need to get to the top. The belief that differences in ability are the main influence on where people end up on the social ladder is so strong that we tend to judge everyone's personal worth, ability, and intelligence by their position in society. Nor is this confined simply to how we judge others. It also affects how people see themselves. Those at the top often believe that they're there because they are naturally endowed with plenty of the right stuff, just as many of those near the bottom think that their low status reflects a lack of ability. That picture, however, is not supported by the latest scientific evidence. First, research now shows that a very major part of what happens to people and where they end up is the result of totally unpredictable influences and occurrences amounting to pure luck. Second, aside from luck, the most important links that exist between ability and status operate in the opposite direction of that imagined by most people. Rather than different endowments of talents determining position in the hierarchy, it's much nearer the truth to say that position in the hierarchy determines abilities, interests, and talents. But let's address luck first. Whether or not we consider ourselves successful, most of us can probably look back across our own life histories and recognize the roles that luck and chance have played in getting us to where we are. We're perhaps lucky with schools or teachers, with the questions on an important exam, with some nameless person dealing with university applications, or we got on well with an interviewer when applying for a job. Perhaps a chance meeting was important, or perhaps an opportunity for promotion came up unexpectedly. Finding a life partner is just as important for our quality of life as our career or income, but we are far happier to acknowledge that chance and luck played a key role in meeting that person than we are in acknowledging luck's role in our career. No one minds mentioning the chance meeting, the circumstances that put you both at ease with each other, or the shared interest that might easily have gone unrecognized. The role of chance makes people's lives highly unpredictable. Although there are huge social class biases in social mobility, there are at the same time vast numbers of people moving up or down the social ladder in ways that even the most detailed analysis of parenting and ability fail to predict. Similarly, although there are differences of perhaps 10 years in the average life expectancy of upper and lower social classes, that explains very little of the individual differences in how long people live. Inevitably, some rich people will die young, and some people live in poverty to a great age. And as some public health mavericks used to say, even if you exercised, ate healthy, and didn't smoke, your most likely cause of death was still heart disease. In addition to all this, there may be a large element of chance in whatever our experiences, including subjective experiences, trigger the kind of epigenetic changes affecting subsequent development that we discussed in the last chapter. Just as the development of weather systems is sometimes said to be so chaotic it can be changed by the flapping of a butterfly's wings, so what amounts to chance events at the social or the cellular level are now thought to play a very substantial part in our lives. So much so, the scientists have worried that if random chance and luck are such important determinants of whether or not an individual becomes sick, gets good exam results, or has a good marriage, it becomes difficult to understand causal pathways at all and to do anything about preventing or remedying bad outcomes. The book, The Inner Level by Wilkinson and Pickett.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, happy Friday, TGIF, Shabbat Shalom, Juma Mubarak. Boy, the hearings are suspended right now, or suspended is not the correct word, paused or whatever. The members of Congress had to go vote, and they're starting to come back into the room, and so I'm guessing in the next 5 or 10 minutes the hearings will resume. It might be a little longer than that. It might be a little less. We'll see how it works out. But as soon as the hearings reconvene, we will be carrying them live throughout the day. So, with that. And that's going to be pretty much our show today. We will have the hearings. We will take calls. I will offer commentary. I'll be popping in from time to time throughout the hearings to let you know who's speaking and what's being said. And so just to bring you up to date, Marie Yovanovitch, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and prior to that she is just an absolutely extraordinary person. I mean, as a foreign service officer, as an ambassador, she was abruptly removed from her post on the 6th of May after being told that she was going to be there for another 3 months. Now, keep in mind, yesterday when I went through this timeline of what happened back in April of this year, that was when Yanukovych, that's when Zelensky won. I'm mixing up my Ukrainian-sounding names here. That was when President Zelensky won the election, which was broadly expected by most of the world. I mean, the polls were showing that Poroshenko, the corrupt former president of Ukraine, was going down in flames. But that's not what the Trump administration thought. I don't know, maybe they'd been watching Fox News or something. But anyhow, so the Trump administration had, through Lev and Igor, cut a corrupt deal with the previous president of Ukraine that sometime next year they would announce that they were going to be investigating, or maybe even sometime late this year, that they were going to be investigating Joe Biden and his son Hunter for corruption. And then Poroshenko gets voted out, and the new guy comes in who is a genuine anti-corruption guy and who knows that there's, that Joe Biden wasn't doing anything corruptly. I mean, his son being on the board of this energy company, it looks kind of skeezy, but that wasn't Joe Biden. And although it's increasingly becoming, I'm sure, problematic for his campaign, and I think this is one of the reasons why you saw Bloomberg jump in, and why you see Deval Patrick now jump into the race, because the billionaire class, the donor class, the Democratic donor class, is starting to freak out about the possibility that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders might be president. But in any case, but I digress. So, they had cut this deal, and so they had to cut a new deal with the new president. And so, Trump, on July 18th, Trump withholds the military aid. On July 25th, Trump demands the Biden probe. This is the famous phone call. On September 1st, Gordon Sondland, the Portland hotelier, who gave Trump $1 million for his EU ambassadorship, he tells Ukraine that the aid is contingent on their, dragging Biden through the mud. On September 9th, the whistleblowers report is communicated to Congress, and then 2 days later, the military aid is magically released. I mean, that's basically the summary of the timeline following that. So anyhow, this morning, Marie Yovanovitch has testified that she was, basically her long history of foreign service. She's still employed by the State Department, by the way, and she has a fellowship at Georgetown University. She testified that Trump pressured the State Department to fire her. She said this was, quote, a concerted campaign against me. And the reason why is because she was opposing Giuliani and Igor and Lev, and the two former corrupt prosecutor generals of Ukraine who were associated with Poroshenko. That she was opposing this shadow diplomacy plan that Trump and his thugs were running in Ukraine to try to smear Joe Biden. She was like, this is not U.S. policy. U.S. policy is to promote, transparency and openness in Ukraine, not to be doing things in Ukraine, not to ask Ukrainians to do things in Ukraine that will help Donald Trump in the 2020 election back in the United States. She said, I was incredulous that the U.S. government chose to remove an ambassador based, as best I can tell, on unfounded and false claims by people with clearly questionable motives. Trump today, or actually last night, this was 8 minutes before midnight last night, Eastern time, Trump tweets, Democrats must apologize to USA. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Vadim Pritsyko said that, quote, United States Ambassador Gordon Sondland did not link financial military assistance to a request for Ukraine to open up an investigation into former VP Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. Ambassador Sondland did not tell us and certainly did not tell me about a connection between the assistance and the investigation, end quote. Now, Trump now is tweeting. Now, just to put this into perspective, Trump is taking the word of a person who is not the president of Ukraine. He's the foreign minister. And this is, I'm guessing that this is a quote from, a few weeks ago when the Trump administration was leaning so heavily on the Ukrainians to do this and to say, oh, Trump didn't do anything wrong. What the Democrats need to do, starting, right this morning, this is another one of those, I was yelling at my TV mornings as I was listening to Adam Schiff's opening talk. You'll recall, for the last couple of weeks, I've been yelling at my TV, quit using quid pro quo, quit using Latin, start talking about bribery. Bribery is specifically named in the Constitution as something to be impeached for. And that's clearly what's going on here. Quid pro quo is simply, Latin for bribery, if it's, got illegal intent. Similarly, obstruction of Congress or obstruction of justice is just another phrase for cover-up. So if anybody listening knows Adam Schiff, please tell him, stop talking about obstruction of Congress or obstruction of justice. You can use that language in your articles of impeachment. That's where it belongs. But when you're talking in public, talk about cover-up or massive cover-up or corrupt cover-up. I mean, pick an adjective. But this is a cover-up. Anyhow, Trump last night declared the fake impeachment inquiry is now dead. Roy Tuckman of KPFK shared with us a quote, I think probably the most cogent quote for the day. This is from Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Sr. He said, every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom, decency, and justice. So in her testimony this morning, Marie Yovanovitch, who worked 33 years in the State Department and Diplomatic Services, was describing how she felt when she discovered that Trump had described her to the president of a foreign country as, quote, bad news. She says, I was shocked and devastated to read about Trump character. She said, the color drained from my face. I think I even had a physical reaction. I think even now words fail me. Mr. Goldman, the Democratic prosecutor questioner, said, now you testified in your opening statement that you had left Ukraine by the time of the July 25th call between Trump and Zelensky. When's the first time you saw the call record for this phone call? And she says, at the end of September. And this is when she talks about how shocked I was. She said, he says, he shows her another clip, another comment from Donald Trump, and says, what was your reaction when you heard the President of the United States refer to you as bad news? Now, think for a moment of what has happened to Christine Blasey Ford. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, she and her family are still in hiding and still receiving regular death threats from right-wingers, from these, the QAnon folks, the people who believe this vast, bizarre conspiracy that Donald Trump has been promoting, and the people around him, including Roger Stone, by the way, who is just convicted on all counts, 7 counts, including he was convicted of lying to Congress. And he said the reason why he lied to Congress was because it would look bad for Donald Trump. I mean, it's looking increasingly like, this is really, really going to harm Trump, in my opinion. So, anyway, so Yovanovitch, she says, I can't believe it. I mean, I was shocked. I was appalled. I was devastated that the President of the United States would talk about any ambassador like that to a foreign head of state. And then this morning, while she's testifying, he tweets that she was a terrible ambassador. And Adam Schiff calls this witness intimidation, which it was.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So we'll be back in just a minute. I'm guessing that probably the hearings will start within the next 10 or 15 minutes. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Paul in Fairbanks, Alaska. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Well, I want to express my disappointment with Democrats in Congress. They don't know how to flex their muscles, and they don't know how to message. The muscle thing, people that don't show up who are given subpoenas should be penalized.
Yes, they should be held in contempt of Congress. Here's the problem. Those contempt citations would go to Bill Barr, and Bill Barr would refuse to do anything with them. He's explicitly said he will refuse to do anything with them. I mean, they've already requested contempt citations against some of these people, and Barr has just not responded.
But does that mean you don't go through with
No, they're doing
the process?
it. They are doing it.
Oh, they are doing it?
Yes.
I thought they could also level fines.
Yes, that's the fines are called civil contempt, and that has to go through a court. And for example, when Obama's Attorney General, who I'm blanking on his name, I can see his face, Eric Holder, when Eric Holder refused to testify for like the third or fourth time before a Republican committee, I think it had to do with Benghazi, or one of those fake scandals that the Republicans were cranking up. He just said, I'm not going to show up. This is just a show trial, and this is silly. I'm not going to show up. The Republicans sued him. They wanted a $1 million fine or whatever it was. That took 7 years to work its way through the courts, where the courts finally dismissed the charges against Eric Holder. So yeah, they could fine him, but it could take 7 years for it to work through its way through the courts.
However long it takes, there would still be penalties.
Yeah.
And I think they should go for it. Another thing about my disappointment is, and my view is that Republicans have the courage to stand up and lie every day.
I don't think that's courage. I think that's corruption. I think that's criminality. Yeah. People who lie are criminals, generally speaking.
The Democrats don't have the courage to stand up and tell the truth.
I think they're doing that right now, Paul. I think they are doing that right now. I thought it was spectacular this morning when Adam Schiff read Trump's tweet, which came 6 minutes after the hearing started, and trashing Ambassador Jovanovic. When Adam Schiff read that tweet and said, what do you think about this? The president just tweeted this, and she said, I feel intimidated. And he said, we take witness intimidation very seriously. It's going to be one of the articles of impeachment, witness intimidation.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I get it that the Democrats are not pounding their fists on the table, Paul. They know that. Keep in mind, the end game here is that there's going to be a trial in the Senate. And these guys in the House, the Democrats in the House, these men and women in the House, they know that if the Republican senators that they're going to need 20 Republican senators to convict Donald Trump and remove him from office. They know that if those senators view this as a purely partisan exercise on the part of the Democrats, they will not be able to join it. They will not be able to vote to convict Donald Trump. Now, the Republicans can play political games all day long, but the Democrats have to look like they are simply doing a solemn, careful, thoughtful, reluctant process to restore the rule of law in the United States. And I think that that's what they're doing. So, Paul, I get it that you'd rather have fireworks, and I would too, frankly, for the pure theater of it, but I think they're doing it the right way. Paul, thanks for the call. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. And you read all about it or see all about it, hear all about it at thomhartmann.com.
Ambassador, congratulate you. You've been down in the secret deposition meeting rooms. You've graduated for your performance today. Later this afternoon, I should note that for the public that we will be back down in the basement of the Capitol doing more of these secret depositions. Ambassador, I just have I don't
Kevin
really
Nunes
have
has a
very many
big job
questions
here.
for you.
He's on the one hand, he's got to kind of dirty her up in order to make her seem less credible. But on the other hand, she's a very sympathetic witness. So let's see how he handles it.
Talk a little bit about Senator Grassley very briefly. I assume that you know who Senator Grassley is.
Yes, sir, I do.
Do you believe that Senator Grassley is a serious and credible elected official?
I have no reason to think otherwise.
Were you involved in the July 25th Trump-Zelensky phone call or preparations for the call?
No, I was not.
Were you involved in the deliberations about the pause in military sales to Ukraine as the Trump administration reviewed newly elected President Zelensky's commitment to corruption reforms?
For the delay in
For the pause.
the pause? No, I was not.
Were you involved in the proposed Trump-Zelensky, later Pence-Zelensky meetings in Warsaw, Poland on September 1st?
No, I was not.
Did you ever talk to President Trump in 2019?
No, I have not.
Mick Mulvaney?
No, I have not.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm not exactly sure what the ambassador is doing here today. This is the House Intelligence Committee that's now turned into the House Impeachment Committee. This seems more appropriate for the Subcommittee on Human Resources at the Foreign Affairs Committee. If there's issues with employment, disagreements with the administration, it would seem like this would be a more appropriate setting instead of an impeachment hearing where,
In other words, this is just a personnel issue here. That's an interesting tact.
any of the accusations that are being hurled at the president for this impeachment inquiry. I have several questions I think Mr. Castor wants to get to. I know Ms. Stefanik, you had a few quick questions for the ambassador. I'll yield to you, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Ambassador Yovanovitch, thank you for being here today.
The gentlewoman will suspend.
What is the interruption for this time? It is our time.
The gentlewoman will suspend. You're not recognized. Mr. Nunes, you are minority counsel.
I just recognized.
Under the House Resolution 660, you're not allowed to yield time except to minority counsel.
The ranking member yielded time to another member of Congress.
No, that is not accurate.
You're gagging the young
That is
lady from
accurate.
New York?
Ambassador Yovanovitch,
This is the Republicans trying to make it look like they're in a kangaroo court kind of situation.
This is the fifth time you have
They're playing
interrupted
victim here.
members of
Listen.
Congress, duly elected members of
The
Congress.
gentlewoman will suspend.
Mr. Chair, we control the time. It's been customary of this committee that whoever controls the time can yield to whoever they wish. If we have members of Congress that have a few questions, it seems appropriate that we be able to let Ms. Stefanik ask her question.
Mr. Nunes,
We are such
you or minority
victims.
counsel recognized.
We are such victims.
All right. Mr. Castor, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Ambassador, welcome. Thank you for your service. 33 years, an extraordinary career.
So they didn't want to go to their lawyer because he did such a terrible job 2 days ago. He was. It wasn't as outrageous as it could have been, was it, Ambassador Taylor? So anyhow, I'll bring you up to date right after this break on what happens over the next 5 minutes, and we'll continue. Stick around.
Today you spent Friday the 11th.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's the House Intelligence Committee interviewing Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Thank you. You were serving a 3-year assignment in the Ukraine, is that correct?
Yes.
And it began in 2016 and was scheduled to end in 2019?
Yes, that's correct.
And nobody
Thom Hartmann
disputes that
Program.
it's up to the
Our vote today
president
on the
to
Thom
decide who his envoys are to posts around the world, correct?
I stated that clearly in my statement.
And you returned from the Ukraine on May 20th, 2019?
That's correct.
And your return coincided with the inauguration of President Zelensky?
Yes.
And you remain employed by the State Department?
I do.
And after you returned to Washington, the Deputy Secretary, John Sullivan, asked you what you wanted to do next. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you met with the Director General, Ambassador Perez,
Yes, that's correct.
to identify a meaningful new assignment.
Yes,
And you now serve at Georgetown University as a fellow.
that's true.
And this is a rewarding position for you?
I'm very grateful to be in that position after what happened.
Today is the second big hearing for the Democrats' impeachment initiative. But we don't understand, or we do understand that you don't have a lot of facts and information relating to the part of this that we're investigating. And those are the events from May 20th up until September 11th, the release of the security assistance funds. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct.
So you were not part of the delegation to the inauguration. That was the day you returned. You were not part of the Oval Office meeting May 23rd, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you were not part of the decision-making relating to whether there would be a White House meeting with President Zelensky?
That's correct.
And you were not a part of any decision-making in the lead-up to the July 25th call?
That's correct.
And you first learned about the call on September 25th, is that correct?
Well, I heard about the call, as I indicated in the first deposition, from Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent.
And what did he tell you about the call?
Well, as it turns out, it wasn't correct, but what I recall is that he said that President Trump had asked President Zelensky whether he could, help him out, and which I understood to be these investigations, and that President Zelensky had said that he is putting in a new prosecutor general, and that he doesn't control. I mean, this is approximately what he said. That person is an independent individual.
Okay, and you learned about that before the call was made public?
That's correct.
Likewise, you were not involved in any discussions surrounding the security sector assistance funds to Ukraine, that they were paused for about 55 days from July 18th to September 11th?
No discussions.
Okay. In your opening statement on page 9, you stated, although then and now I've always understood that I served at the pleasure of the president, I still find it difficult to comprehend that foreign and private interests were able to undermine U.S. interests in this way. Individuals who apparently felt stymied by our efforts to promote stated U.S. policy against corruption, that is to do the mission, were able to successfully conduct a campaign of disinformation against the sitting ambassador using unofficial back channels. Do you believe that President Trump was aiming to weaponize corruption in Ukraine by removing you?
I don't know that.
Okay. Do you believe your removal was part of some scheme to make it easier for elements of the Ukrainian establishment to do things counter to U.S. interests?
I think that's certainly what the Ukrainian establishment hoped. I think that in addition, there were Americans, these two individuals, who were working with Mayor Giuliani, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, who have recently been indicted by the Southern District of New York, who indicated that they wanted to change out the ambassador. And I think they must have had some reason for that.
And do you think they were seeking a different type of ambassador that would allow them to achieve some of their objectives?
I don't know what other reason there would be.
Okay. Is Ambassador Taylor the type of person that would facilitate those objectives?
No.
So Ambassador Taylor is a man of high integrity?
Absolutely.
And he's a good pick for the post?
He is. I would note that he is the chargé out there, as of course you understand. So no ambassador has yet been, or no candidate has yet been named to the position.
But he certainly has had a decorated career serving his country.
Absolutely, a man of the highest integrity.
You testified about when you first learned that Mayor Giuliani and some of his associates had a concerted campaign against you. When did that first come to your attention?
We were picking up rumors from Ukrainians. I think, kind of in the November, December 2018 time period.
We're back with the hearings into the.
Then in January, February, and of course,
we're back with the hearings.
March, it became more obvious.
At some point, I believe you testified that Minister Avakov alerted you to this campaign?
Yes.
And when was that?
He had a conversation with me in February of 2019.
Okay. And do you remember what he related to you?
Yes. He said that Mr. Lutsenko was working with Mayor Giuliani through these two individuals, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, that they basically wanted to remove me from post, and that they were working on that.
And did you have any awareness at that point in time of precisely why they were seeking your ouster?
I didn't. I didn't understand that at all because I had never met Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, and so it was unclear to me why they were interested in doing this.
Were you especially influential implementing policies that stymied their interests in Ukraine? Were advocating for some sort of environment or policies that would be adverse to them?
I think that
this guy has the toughest job
just the general
in D.C. right now.
Obviously,
it will continue.
U.S. ambassadors, U.S. embassies, one of our most important functions is to facilitate U.S. business abroad, right? Whether it's trade, whether it's commerce, that's one of the things that we do. And but everything has to be above board. We believe in a level playing ground and so forth, but we obviously advocate for U.S. business. These two individuals, with hindsight and what we learned later, looking to open up a new energy company exporting liquefied natural gas to Ukraine, never actually came to the embassy, which is unusual because that would usually be a first stop. Going to the American Chamber of Commerce, going to the U.S. Embassy, get the lay of the land, see how we could provide assistance.
And was that source of frustration ever expressed to you, or did you just learn that separately?
Source of frustration? What do you mean? On whose part?
On Fruman and Parnas.
I don't know that they were frustrated. I mean,
Okay.
Frustrated by what?
Well, you mentioned that they had business interests, and I asked you whether they had been stymied by anything in particular that you had advocated for, or you were a roadblock to them being successful.
Yeah.
I wondered if there was any connection.
I'd never met them. When I heard those names for the first time, which was in February of 2019, I asked my team, the econ and the commercial sections are the ones who would usually meet with American businessmen and women, and nobody had heard of them. So all I can conclude is that it was the general U.S. policies that we were implementing that might have been of concern to them.
Okay. And at any point, did you ever try to reach out to the Prosecutor General, Mr. Lutsenko, and find out why he was participating in this concerted campaign?
No.
And then why didn't you do that?
I didn't feel that there was any purpose to it.
And why not?
He is, he clearly had I would say, an animus for doing this, and he was working with Americans. So I reached out to the American side, in this case, the State Department, to try and find out what was going on.
When did you first realize that your relationship with Lutsenko had reached a adversarial point?
Probably around that time, maybe a little bit earlier.
And this is March?
Yeah, and what I would say, adversarial, that's a really strong word. We at the U.S. Embassy are visiting key people from the State Department and other agencies. We were pushing the Ukrainians, including Mr. Lutsenko, to do what they said that they were going to do when Mr. Lutsenko entered office, that he was going to clean up the PGO and make reforms, that he was going to bring justice to the what they call the Heavenly Hundred, the people who died on the Maidan in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity, and he was going to prosecute cases to repatriate the approximately $40 billion it's believed that former President Yanukovych and his cronies fled the country with. And he didn't do any of that. And we, kept on trying to encourage him to do the right thing. That's what the Ukrainian people wanted him to do, and we thought it was a good plan and that he should do it.
And then you mentioned you contacted the State Department in late March. Was that Under Secretary Hale?
So contacted about what?
About the concerns you had about the campaign against you?
I contacted the State Department much earlier than that. I mean, it was an ongoing sort of discussion, makes it sound very formal. We have many ways of going back and forth with Washington.
This is the Republicans' lawyer, and he's got this real challenge of trying to seem like he's doing his job. He's interrogating her, he's questioning her, but trying not to be adversarial, and hoping he can get something that will impeach her, that will cause people to question what she said. So, but it doesn't seem to be working. Here she is. We continue.
There was maybe somebody else waiting in the wings, et cetera, and that undermined not only my position but our U.S. position. The Ukrainians didn't know what to think, and we need to be out there all the time, firing on all cylinders to promote our national security interests. So it was a concern.
And when did you realize this concerted campaign against you was a real threat?
A threat?
A threat to your ability to do the job in Kyiv?
Well, I would say that when you go into a meeting with somebody and they ask, are you going to be leaving, that is concerning. So that probably, I don't know exactly when that started happening, but in that time frame.
And did you undertake any efforts to push back on this narrative, either inside the State Department or publicly?
Well, certainly with the Ukrainians, I said, there's nothing to this. This is, a distraction, and we are focused on the job. Our policy remains the same. Yes, we had discussions in the State Department about this.
In hindsight, do you think you did enough inside the State Department to alert them to this this mounting campaign against you?
I did what I could.
And what was that?
Reached out to the European Bureau. I think you've also heard that Dr. Fiona Hill was aware of this as well, so the NSC, and they had other discussions with more senior people.
Okay. And did you get any feedback from your chain of command? I mean, did you engage Ambassador Rieker,
Yes.
Under Secretary Hale?
Yes.
And
yes.
Did you develop sort of a game plan to push back against these allegations?
So, I mean, there are different timeframes here that we're talking about. So, fast forwarding to March, I did, when Under Secretary Hale asked whether I would consider extending, I did raise, because I wasn't sure that he was aware of it. I wanted to make sure that he knew that Mayor Giuliani had been out there saying things about me, untrue things, and I wanted him to be aware of that. And he said, he understood. He still was hoping that I could extend for another year. So that was early March, and then fast forward to late March. And, the discussions about this issue continued, but obviously once it became a public political story here in the United States, the tenor of everything changed, because I think that the State Department felt that it wasn't.
Also, March, April was when the election happened and the new president came in, dedicated to stopping corruption.
For me to come back in July.
Do you think there was anything you could have done differently to get ahead of the story and to lobby the secretary and his counselor, Mr. Breckbuell, that there was a concerted campaign against you, that you didn't believe the allegations lodged were accurate and you needed their assistance?
I think that, sure, maybe I could have done that, but I think they were aware. And as I subsequently learned from Deputy Secretary Sullivan,
he's basically saying, why did you allow yourself to be a victim?
Since the summer of 2018.
And I don't think it's working.
The corruption's endemic in the country of Ukraine, right?
I would say that corruption is a serious issue everywhere in the former Soviet Union. It's a post-Soviet legacy. And we talk about it a lot in Ukraine because there's actually an opportunity to do something, to actually help the Ukrainians tackle the issue. They want to tackle the issue. In other countries, like Russia, you can't even talk about it. So I think it's a post-Soviet legacy, and it's important to deal with it.
And that you testified rampant corruption has long permeated Ukraine's political and economic systems?
Yes, that's a fair statement.
And it's your belief that it should be the U.S. foreign policy to help Ukraine curb its corruption problem?
Yes, because it's good for the Ukrainians, but it's also in our interests.
And anti-corruption efforts, you mentioned, serve a national security purpose?
I believe that to be true.
Are oligarchs a big part of the problem in Ukraine?
Probably, because so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very, very few, 6 or 7 individuals, and they also have political power and control the media.
And a lot of their power has been acquired through what we here in the U.S. would consider improper ways?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
This is extraordinary. I mean, this is actually very damaging testimony to Trump, coming from the Republican counsel, which is why Devin Nunes didn't want to defer to him.
But I know who you're talking about.
George Kent testified a couple days ago that he was investigating for stealing millions and millions of dollars, some of which had been supplied by the U.S., Great Britain, subject to an investigation. Trying to get the money back. That was a big part of Mr. Kent's initiatives when he was there. That a bribe was paid to the prosecutors, and Zlochevsky was let off the hook. This was in 2014. Is this something that you're familiar with?
I've heard about it. This was before my arrival. And I would just say my understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. money that you're referring to was the money that we used to fund an FBI team that was embedded with the Prosecutor General's office to go after. Not to go after, but to do the investigation of Burisma and Zlochevsky.
Mr. Kent testified that this bribe was paid, the prosecution went away, and essentially nothing has been further done with regards to Burisma. During your tenure in Ukraine, has there ever been any focus on re-examining allegations? Whether it's at Burisma or other powerful interests like Zlochevsky, re-examining it?
Is that on the part of the Ukrainian government? Is that what you're talking about?
Trying to lean on the various prosecutors general to clean up the oligarchical system?
I think, yes, there have been some efforts, and as I mentioned earlier...
Meanwhile, Roger Stone was just convicted, and Trump just tweeted, so now they convict Roger Stone!
Mr. Lutsenko's nomination to the position
Visit
of...
TomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're listening to the Republicans' counsel questioning Marie Yovanovitch, and we'll be right back.
A U.S. audience, but in Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union more broadly, including in Russia, the justice system, whether it's cops on the beat, whether it's investigators, whether it is prosecutors, whether it is judges, are used as a tool of the political system to be used against your political adversaries. And so I think that, going back to your question about Burisma and Zlochevsky, my understanding, this was, as I told you earlier in the previous deposition, this did not loom large when I arrived. I arrived in 2016, August 2016. But over time, my understanding was that the case was basically sort of on a pause, that it wasn't an active case, but it also was not fully closed. And that is a way, as I mentioned before, for those in power to keep a little hook in to Burisma and Mr. Zlochevsky.
And right around the time the bribe was paid, Burisma undertook an effort to spruce up their board, and they added, I believe, the president of Poland and some other luminaries. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I don't exactly know what the timing of all of this was.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, to the elements.
And, one of the folks they added to the board was the vice president's son, Hunter Biden, which raises questions. Is he a genius on the corporate governance front? Is he a genius with the Ukrainian oligarchical systems and cleaning that up? Or was he just added to the board because he's the vice president's son? Was that ever, a concern, or at least the perception of that concern addressed?
As I said, I arrived in August of 2016. Several months before the elections and several months before President Trump took office. And it was not a focus of what I was doing in that 6-month period.
Okay. Was the issue ever raised at all?
Not.
He was still on the board, I think, at the time.
Yeah, my understanding from newspaper accounts is that he just recently left in 2019. I never met him, never talked to him. And I'm sorry, what was your question?
He was still on the board when you arrived at Post, and was just wondering if at least the perception problem was brought to your attention as the ambassador.
I was aware of it because, as I told you before, in the deposition, there had been in terms of the preparation for my Senate confirmation hearings for Ukraine, there was a question about that and a select answer. So I was aware of it.
Okay.
Yes.
In your deposition, you acknowledged that the president has longstanding concerns about corruption in Ukraine. Is that true?
That's what he says.
Well, going back to, there was a meeting with President Poroshenko in September of 2017 in the Oval Office, and I believe you testified that, he expressed his concerns then.
Yeah, he said that a friend of his had told him that Ukraine was the most corrupt country in the world.
Okay. Several witnesses have testified.
This guy is really struggling.
President,
we'll be right back.
Has concerns that there are certain elements of the Ukrainian establishment that during 2016 were out to get him. Is that something you were aware of at any point in time?
Well, I'm certainly aware of it now. Obviously, there's been a lot of press attention on that. It was not.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
About this, what it means, where it could go.
Article at the time, or did that only come to your attention subsequently?
It's certainly been brought to my attention subsequently.
The lawyer for the Republicans is still questioning Ambassador Yovanovitch, and it seems to be tying himself up in knots.
Did you aim to get to the bottom of that? Because, you know, if the reporting's true, if what Mr. Lupa told Mr. Vogel is accurate, that would be concerning, correct?
Well, I was the ambassador in Ukraine starting in August of 2016. And what you're describing, if true, as you said, what you're describing took place in the United States. So if there were concerns about what Ms. Chalupa was doing, I think that would have been handled here.
And do you know Ms. Chalupa?
I don't believe so.
Have you ever met her?
I don't think so. I mean, if she worked for the Ukrainian embassy, it's possible that I met her in a large group or something, but I don't believe I know her.
Are you aware of the role that investigative journalist Mr. Lashenko played in publicizing the Manafort black ledgers?
Yes.
And he publicized some information in a pretty grand way in August of 2016, and almost immediately coincided with Mr. Manafort leaving the Trump campaign. Was there anything about that issue when it was occurring that concerned you?
Well, I certainly noticed it because I was, a week or so away from arriving in Ukraine. I think that from a Ukrainian perspective, I realize we are looking at this from an American perspective. From a Ukrainian perspective, I think that what Mr. Lashenko and others who were looking into the Black Ledger were most concerned about was actually not Mr. Manafort, but former President Yanukovych and his political party and the amount of money that they allegedly stole and where it went and so forth. I mean, I think there's just a difference in perspective depending on which country you're in.
But you can understand the president, at least from his perspective, looking at these facts, it certainly is reasonable to conclude that there are elements of the Ukrainian establishment that are advocating against them at this point in time, correct?
Well, just speaking about Mr. Lashenko,
that is called leading the witness, what you just heard.
He got access to the Black Ledger, and he published it, as I think journalists would do. And again, I'm not sure that I don't have any information to suggest that was targeting President Trump.
And she's not.
The way the events unfolded,
she's not letting him be led. She's not letting him lead her. This is fascinating.
Subsequently left the campaign.
Maria Ivanovich is taking on the lawyer for the Republicans. We'll be right back.
And Manafort's ties to Russia and so forth.
I think, again, I think that that may have been the effect here in the United States. And obviously it was of interest to journalists and others here that Mr. Manafort was former President Yanukovych's political advisor, and he was the political advisor, head of a campaign here. And so we all know that there have been court cases and so forth where Mr. Manafort was found guilty of certain actions. But at the end of the day, President Trump won the elections.
With Mr. Lashenko's reporting, I mean, there's been a question of whether all the information that he published was authentic, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
There's been some have questioned whether the information Mr. Leshchenko published was all correct, or whether it was doctored.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Ambassador Chali, during the August timeframe, he wrote an op-ed in The Hill taking issue with then candidate Trump. Were you aware of that when it occurred?
Yes.
And did you have any communications with the ambassador to express concerns?
No.
And how frequently did you communicate with the ambassador? Obviously, you're in different posts in different countries, but
Yeah. Didn't actually see him or talk to him that
so
often.
you weren't in frequent communication?
No.
Can you see how, writing an op-ed, even, given the substance, we've discussed the substance of it, that there's some sensitivities, but can you see how just the simple fact of writing an op-ed, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., might create a perception that there are elements of the Ukrainian establishment that were advocating against then candidate Trump?
My recollection of that op-ed was that he was taking he was critical of a policy position that President Trump had with regard to Crimea, and whether Crimea was, a part of Ukraine or a part of Russia. That's a tremendously sensitive issue in Ukraine, and my recollection is that that is what Ambassador Chali was writing about.
And do you know whether the ambassador or anybody from the embassy tried to make contact with the Trump camp to talk about their concerns before lodging an op-ed?
I don't know.
Okay. During the same time period of the run-up to the election, the Minister Avakov had said some especially candid things about then candidate Trump on some various social media platforms. Are you aware of that?
Yes, as a result of the deposition, okay. The previous deposition.
But during the relevant time period when it was happening, you weren't aware of that?
I don't recall it.
Okay. He's one of the more influential officials in the Ukraine, correct?
He is.
And I believe he's one of the few that span both the Poroshenko administration and the Zelensky administration.
Yes, that's correct.
Looking back on his comments in hindsight, do you see how that might create a perception that a very influential Ukrainian was advocating against then candidate Trump?
That he was doing what? I'm sorry?
Just advocating. He was out to get him. I mean, he said some real nasty things.
Well, sometimes that happens on social media, and are you asking me whether it's appropriate? Probably not. But I would say that Minister Avakov has been, as well as others, both in President Poroshenko's administration as well as in the Zelensky administration, has been a good partner to the United States. As I think I told you before, he's a very practical man and looking for partners and getting the job done.
I'm shocked that social media would be the site of negative comments. You certainly can
This guy is so far out of his league, it's scary.
The president, aware of Minister Avakov's statements, aware of what Mr. Leshchenko was up to, what Ambassador Chali was up to, and these other elements that we've discussed, that there certainly forms a reasonable basis to wonder whether there are influential elements of the Ukrainian establishment that were out to get the president.
Again, I can't speak for what President Trump thought or what others thought. I would just say that those elements that you've recited don't seem to me to be the Ukrainian, kind of a plan or a plot of the Ukrainian government to work against President Trump or anyone else. They're isolated incidents. Mm-hmm. We all know, I'm coming to find out myself, that public life can be, people are critical. And that does not mean that someone is, or a government is undermining either a campaign or interfering in elections. And I would just remind again that our own U.S. intelligence community has conclusively determined that those who interfered in the election were in Russia.
Tweet this morning, it is a U.S. president's absolute right to appoint ambassadors. I'm a little troubled by this idea of an absolute right, because that doesn't feel to me like the system of government we have here. I think that how and why we exercise our powers and rights matters. Ambassador, when you're ambassador somewhere, do you have the right to ask the intelligence community, the CIA in an embassy, what operations they're doing?
We talk about these things collaboratively. There's some things that, in short, yes.
So you have the right to ask the intelligence community in your embassy what they're doing. Why might you do that?
Because sometimes operations have political consequences.
Right. So the performance of your duties in the interests of the United States gives you the right to ask very sensitive questions of our intelligence community in your embassy. But what if instead of working through the issues that you just described, you went to dinner that night and handed over that information to a Russian agent for $10,000? Would that be an appropriate exercise of your right?
No, it would not.
It would not. And what would happen to you if you did that?
Well, I can't even begin to imagine, but I would imagine that I would be pulled out of post.
Right. And this is not about ambassadors, right? A police officer has the right to pull you over. But if the police officer pulls over his ex-wife because he's angry, that's probably not right. I have the right. In fact, today, I cast a bunch of votes. But if I cast those votes not in the interest of my constituents, but because somebody bribed me, that is a severe abuse of my power. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
So I guess the question is, why, after an exemplary performance as ambassador to Ukraine, did the president decide that you should be removed? Because I think we just agreed that if that was not done in the national interest, that's a problem. Ambassador, if you had remained ambassador to Ukraine, would you have recommended to the president of the United States that he asked the new Ukrainian president to investigate, and I'm quoting from the transcript here, CrowdStrike or the server?
No, I would repeat once again that the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that it was the Russians.
Okay, so Ambassador, if you had remained as ambassador and not been summarily dismissed, would you have supported a 3-month delay in congressionally mandated military aid to Ukraine?
As the thing that's going to save us from climate change.
Ambassador, if you had remained as ambassador of Ukraine, would you have recommended to the president that he ask a new president of Ukraine to, quote, find out about Biden's son?
No.
I have no more questions. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the record. Dear colleague, letter from Speaker Pelosi dated September 23rd. Relevant part reads, we also expect that he will establish a path for the whistleblower to speak directly to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees as required by law.
Without objection.
Thank you. I look forward to you honoring that statement from the Speaker. Attorney Ambassador, I, for one, want to thank you so very much for a long service, exemplary service for to our country and on behalf of our nation. Lots been said about what was going on around the phone call. I'd like to focus more on what's happened since then.
Okay, we were listening to Jim Himes, where we've now moved to a Republican member of Congress who's questioning
you got the word, anytime the
so we'll see how this
changes
goes.
post, there's a process you go through to depict what you do next. And that happened in this instance.
This is Mike Conaway from Texas, Republican from Texas.
What happened when you came back here as to what your next assignment would be at state?
So when I came back, obviously it was sort of out of cycle. There was nothing set up.
Sure.
And again, I am grateful that Deputy Secretary Sullivan asked me what I would like to do next. I recalled that there was the fellowship at Georgetown and asked whether that might be something that could be arranged.
Was that your only choice?
I'm not sure. We didn't really discuss other options.
My sense is Georgetown is fertile ground for State Department recruitment of future fledgling Foreign Service officers, and so they now benefit from your experience and your inspiration to inspire them to have spend their professional life in service to our nation.
Thank you.
You're a fellow there. You teach classes. How many classes do you teach?
Well, this semester I was supposed to teach 2. I am still teaching one on national security. The other one was on Ukraine, and I asked whether I could,
defer on that. How many students in your class?
I think he's just like trying to pass time and be friendly. I don't get where he's going with this. Back to it.
Any other responsibilities at state other than the fellowship at Georgetown?
Well, I will tell you that all of this has kept me very busy.
Okay, I got that. But no necessarily day-to-day things that you'd be responsible for. Other than
And by the
not
way,
qualifying for overseas
Speaker Pelosi
stipends
just
and
came
other
out
things, is your
and
compensation
made a
affected
statement
by being
that witness
recalled?
intimidation is a crime.
Okay.
This is very interesting.
Worried
Donald
about
Trump is burying
you
himself.
might be treated by your fellow employees at state. Any negative, they hold you in less high regard than they used to as a result of this? Do they shun you at the lunch counter? Or do they treat you badly as a result of the way you were treated by the president?
I've actually received an outpouring of support from my
so
colleagues.
the folks
I think what he's trying to establish is that Trump hasn't hurt her. Although, saying that she's a terrible person, basically, and she's going to go through some things to a former president, to a colleague, to another foreign president, is pretty grim. He's like, oh, I would sure like that.
Any reason on earth that you can think of that George Kent would be saying that because of some reason other than the fact that he believes it in his heart of hearts?
Like what?
Well, I mean, like somebody paid him to do it.
Oh, no, absolutely
Okay, so
not.
you and I agree that we think he was sincere in that bragging on you, and that's all post recall episode that was been much of the discussion this morning. Well, I'm glad that your colleagues, I would have expected nothing any different from your colleagues at state to continue to treat you with the high regard that you've earned over all these years of great service. And I hope that whatever you decide to do after the Georgetown Fellowship, that you're as successful there as you've been.
You're listening
in the first
to the
33
Thom
years. With that,
Hartmann
I yield the
Program.
balance of my
Call
time.
202-808-9925.
That an article.
So it's really rather pathetic what these Republicans are trying to pull off. I mean, they just can't get their hands around this at all. We'll be back with more of the hearings.
Put in the record.
Without objection.
I have a unanimous consent request that an article entitled Whistleblower Reaches Agreement to Testify will appear very soon. Representative Adam Schiff says, USA Today, September 29th, 2019.
Without objection.
I have a unanimous consent request. Article entitled Schiff Confirms Tentative Agreement for Whistleblower to Testify Before House Intelligence Committee, CNN, September 29th, 2019.
Without objection.
I have a unanimous consent request. Intelligence panel has deal to hear whistleblowers' testimony, says Schiff. Washington Post, September 29th, 2019.
Without objection.
I have a unanimous consent request. An article entitled Whistleblower Reportedly Agrees to Testify Before House Intelligence Committee, reported by Schiff. Huffington Post, September 29th, 2019.
Without objection.
I have a unanimous consent request. An article entitled Schiff Panel Will Hear from Whistleblower, Arkansas Democrat Gazette, September 29th, 2019.
Without objection. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, in your prior testimony, you spoke so movingly about your family background. You stated that your parents fled communist and Nazi regimes and that they valued freedom and democracy offered in America, having experienced totalitarian regimes. Did that have any effect on your desire to enter into the United States Foreign Service?
Yes, it did.
Did you always know that you wanted to be in the Foreign Service? I look at your background, and it is perfectly suited for what you're doing. I note that you have studied at the Pushinsky State Russian Language Institute in Russia to learn Russian.
Yeah.
That you have do you also have an MS from the National Defense University National War College?
Yes.
I even noticed that you earned your undergraduate degree in history and Russian studies in college, and coincidentally, that was also my college. But I wanted, and you definitely are doing Princeton in the nation's service by what you do every day. But I really want to know how it felt to have your reputation sullied, not for state and nation, but for personal gain. You spoke about how your service is not just your own personal service, it affects your family. And today we've seen you as this former ambassador, this 33-year veteran of the Foreign Service. But I want to know about you personally and how this has affected you personally and your family.
Yeah. It's been a difficult time. I mean, I'm a private person. I don't want to put all that out there, but it's been a very, very difficult time because the president does have the right to have his own or her own ambassador in every country in the world.
But does the president have the right to actually malign people's character? I mean, it may not be against any law, but I would think that it would be against decorum and decency.
I mean, there's a question as to why the kind of campaign to get me out of Ukraine happened. Because all the president has to do is say he wants a different ambassador. And in my line of work, perhaps in your line of work as well, all we have is our reputation. And so this has been a very painful period.
How has it affected your family?
I really don't want to get into that, but thank you for asking.
Because I do care. I also want to know how you think it affected your fellow colleagues in the Foreign Service. My Republican colleagues have said that since you received such adulation from and embracing from your own fellow colleagues, that what occurred, the incident that occurred with the president and his cronies, you know, maligning your reputation, how has that had a chilling effect on the ability and the morale within the Foreign Service? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that it has had exactly that, a chilling effect, not only in Embassy Kyiv, but throughout the State Department, because people don't know kind of whether their efforts to pursue our stated policy are going to be supported. And that is a dangerous place to be.
Now, for the record, my Republican colleagues will probably try to paint you as a never-Trumper. Are you a never-Trumper?
No.
As a Foreign Service officer, you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States without regard for who's in office. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Have you also served in your 33 years for not just Democratic presidents, but also Republican presidents?
For Republican presidents.
For Republican presidents. In fact, you joined the Foreign Service under Reagan. Is that not right?
Yes, that's true.
Now, why do you think it's really important that Foreign Service officers are nonpartisan? Can you talk to us about why it's important for you to do your job and your fellow Foreign Service officers to do your job, that you're nonpartisan?
Yeah, because our work is essentially nonpartisan. And, you know, Senator Vandenberg, a Republican senator who actually partnered with President Truman, coined a phrase that politics should stop at the water's edge. And I think that's exactly right, because while obviously the competition of ideas in a democracy with different parties, different individuals is hugely important, but at the end of the day, when we are dealing with other countries, it needs to be about what is right for the United States. Those are our national security interests. And whether an individual works for the CIA or the military or the State Department, we've got to be nonpartisan and thinking about what is right for the United States.
Well, on behalf of a grateful nation, I want to say thank you for your service, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
Ambassador, I want to say I have a great deal of respect for what you do. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee. I've worked with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, including being its president, and I know the complexity of what you do. I know you have little access directly to decision makers, little resources, but you have still a great deal of responsibility. It's a complex task. And I want to take us from just the concept of one-dimensional Ukraine being corrupt to the other issues that you had to deal with as the Ukraine ambassador. You had to deal with more than just our bilateral relationship with Ukraine, for example. And I'd like confirmation that, I mean, obviously I know you know these, but these were on your portfolio. You had to deal with the issue of the OSCE Budapest Agreement and the denuclearization of Ukraine and the issues of its territorial integrity of the signatories, correct?
Could you run that by me again?
The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation for Europe, and the Budapest Agreement, under which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and believed they had its territorial integrity guaranteed by the United States and Russia. You would have had that in your portfolio.
Well, that
was an issue you would have to deal with the Ukrainians on.
Yeah, when the Ukrainians would ask about our policy and whether it was in keeping with the Budapest Agreement.
Excellent. NATO. Ukraine is an aspiring NATO country. And of course, you have the Bucharest summit where the U.S. and the NATO allies made a statement that they would get membership. That would have been on your portfolio. They would have been discussing with you.
Yes, certainly aspirations to NATO membership will be.
And it's also consistent with U.S. policy that the U.S. supports Ukraine joining the EU, and they have a great deal of interest and desire for joining the EU, correct?
Yes.
And they just had a summit in Ukraine in July where they talked about the associated agreement on economic integration between the Ukraines and the EU. And they also had a discussion about the illegal annexation of Crimea and the blocking by Russia of the Ukrainian sailors that came out of the Azov Sea and that were captured. Those would have all been issues that would have been in your portfolio and that were consistent with what the EU's issues are, correct?
Yes. We work closely with our EU partners.
In addition to Ukraine, you'd have to work with France and UK and Germany, all of which you have different ideas of.
What he's trying to do here basically is saying it's okay that Gordon Sondland was in Ukraine messing with Ukraine.
Yeah. Did you say they all have different ideas about these issues?
Some of them, yes.
But mostly there's a consensus.
You'd have to work with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, on issues that we heard about: legal aid, human trafficking, building democratic institutions, and even HIV/AIDS, right?
Yes.
And you've spoken at several NGOs while you were the ambassador to Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, they would have under their portfolio aspiring nations to the EU, would they not?
Yeah.
Okay, so EU Ambassador Sondland then would have had Ukraine in his portfolio because they're an inspiring nation and he's our U.S. ambassador to the EU, correct?
I think he testified that one of his first
discussions. But you agree that it's within his portfolio, correct? You would agree that it's in his portfolio, would you not? Yes.
I would agree.
Yes, thank you. Now, I want to go to the next.
I'm sorry, can you finish your answer,
Richard
please?
Holbrooke is a person who, which I have a great deal of reverence for.
Ambassador Yovanovitch should not finish her answer. You may finish your answer, Ambassador.
Not out of my time. You're done.
No,
right?
Ambassador. The ambassador will be recognized.
I would say that all EU ambassadors deal with other countries, including aspiring countries, but it is unusual to name the U.S. ambassador to the EU to be responsible for all aspects of Ukraine.
I'll take your additional answer. It's still in his portfolio, which was my question. You knew Ambassador Holbrooke, probably. I did. He's a man of great integrity, one of our most successful ambassadors. You know him probably by his reputation. You would agree that he was a man of great reputation, right?
Yes.
Yes. Madam Ambassador, would it surprise you if in 2004 John Kerry had a member of his campaign who was a foreign policy advisor who traveled to the Ukraine in July and met with Ukrainian officials and the U.S. ambassador? Would that surprise you? And a member of John Kerry's campaign team for President of the United States in 2004 traveled to Ukraine, met with the U.S. ambassador in July.
Not necessarily.
Would you have taken that meeting if a member of John Kerry's campaign traveled to the Ukraine? Would you have taken that meeting?
I guess it would depend on what the purpose of the meeting was.
Well, that meeting actually occurred, and it was with John Holbrooke. John Holbrooke was a private citizen, traveled to Ukraine, met with the U.S. ambassadors, met with Ukrainian officials. He was also there on about HIV/AIDS, which was, in addition, something that the Clinton Foundation was working on. So we have a official of the John Kerry campaign in 2004 as a private citizen meeting with our ambassador in Ukraine.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Is that unusual?
We meet with private individuals all the time.
It probably wasn't unusual for Giuliani.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Carson, you're recognized.
So he was trying to say, oh, Giuliani, that's just fine. You know, John Kerry tried to do that.
Of corruption.
Yeah.
We heard evidence that you were
Now we have
promoting efforts to
Mr.
address
Carson,
corruption.
a Democrat.
On Wednesday, in testifying about your very sterling career as a champion of anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent said, quote, "You can't promote principled anti-corruption action without pissing off corrupt people," end quote. It seems that your efforts as ambassador to essentially reform the powerful prosecutor general's office in Ukraine did exactly that. Madam Ambassador, what concerned you about the prosecutor general's office when you were the ambassador in Ukraine?
What concerned us was that there didn't seem to be any progress in the three overall objectives that Mr. Lutsenko had laid out, most importantly for the Ukrainian people, but also the international community. So the first thing was reforming the prosecutor
That little echo
general's
there
office.
is coming from the congressional hearing. It sounds like there's more than one microphone open.
Authority not only to conduct investigations, so an FBI-like function, but also to do the actual prosecution. So very, very wide powers, which is part of that Soviet legacy. And there just wasn't a lot of progress in that. There wasn't a lot of progress in handling personnel issues and how the structure should be organized and who should have the important jobs, because some of the people in those jobs were known to, were considered to be corrupt themselves. Secondly, the issue that was tremendously important to the Ukrainian people of bringing justice to the over 100 people who died on the Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. Nobody has been held accountable for that. And that is, you know, kind of an open wound for the Ukrainian people. And thirdly, Ukraine needs all the money that it has. And there is a strong belief that former President Yanukovych and those around him made off with over $40 billion. $40 billion, that's a lot in the US. It's a huge amount of money in Ukraine. And so, again, nobody has, none of that money has really been, I think maybe $1 billion was repatriated, but the rest of it is still missing.
Madam Ambassador, was the head of that office corrupt?
We believe so.
And you got the sense, did you not, that he was a driving force behind some of the attacks against you?
I did.
Which ultimately led to your removal, correct?
Yes.
But it wasn't just him. His allegations were picked up and spread by Mr. Giuliani and Donald Trump Jr., were they not?
Yes.
So let me get this straight. You were effective at fighting corruption in the Ukraine. Fighting that corruption was important to the national security of the United States, and you were punished for that, ultimately being removed from your post by the President of the United States. So in your opinion, Madam Ambassador, why is it important to have a nonpartisan career in the foreign services?
I think it's important to have a nonpartisan career foreign service office, or service, I should say.
Sure.
Because what we do is inherently nonpartisan. It is about our national security interests. It's not about what is good for a particular party at a particular time. It has to be about the greater interests of our security in, frankly, what is an increasingly dangerous world.
And could you briefly describe for us what broad U.S. policies you have sought to advance in your 33 years of service, and specifically in post-Soviet states like Ukraine?
Well, that's a broad question. But I think that certainly in my time in Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, all of these countries are very different, as is Ukraine. But I think that establishing positive, constructive relations to the extent that we can with those countries is really important. And that, you know, I mean, there are three basic areas. One is security, the second is economic, and the third is political. And so working all the sub-issues, your colleague mentioned many of them, you know, we certainly did that in Ukraine as well.
Thank you for your service. I yield to the chairman.
Thanks.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for being here. And I just want to start by saying I appreciate your years of service.
This is Republican
and enduring years
Winstrom
of moving around the world to dangerous places. And hearing from you today, I realize that we share some of the same feelings and experiences as an Army Reserve surgeon. I received a call on a Monday afternoon in March of 2005 that told me I was being deployed to Iraq and I had to be out the door in the next 2 to 3 days. I had patients scheduled for months. I had surgeries scheduled and had to go. So I understand that shocking feeling that can come with some abrupt change like that. And I was processing a few days later, and I was told
What's absolutely fascinating to me is how the Republicans are trying to be nice to her.
I served a year in Iraq.
You know, they basically, you know, and a day before yesterday with Kent and Taylor, you know, some of them tried to be nice, but most of them weren't.
Relationship with what
but
you
now,
were
you know, it seems like, I think that they've all figured out Trump is guilty as hell.
And sadly today, even though it helped to remove Saddam Hussein, they still have corruption concerns in Iraq. And I can relate to what you said just a few moments ago, that it feels like an open wound when it hasn't been resolved. But you might imagine, with that military experience and background, I take an interest in military strategy and capabilities and the thoughts of those with boots on the ground, like you and Mr. Volker and Mr. Taylor. In your deposition on page 144, your quote is saying, in terms of lethal assistance, we all felt it was very significant that this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. Just real quick, who in general makes up we all? Would that be the team I mentioned?
Yeah, can I just look at that? Just one second. What line is that?
Well, I have to move on. So you said we all felt it was very significant that this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. I assume that is those that have boots on the ground. And then this administration, I assume you meant the Trump administration.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In your deposition, also on page 144, you spoke about the generosity of Congress. You mentioned it today, increasing aid to Ukraine. And part of your deposition, after that statement that I quoted before, you were asked, did you advocate for that? You responded, yes. Then you were asked, did you advocate for that prior to the new administration in 2016? And you responded, well, yeah. On page 148, the question was, were you satisfied that the administration was doing what was necessary to support Ukraine? You said, in what respect? And they said, in, helping them deter Russian aggression, helping them with foreign aid and foreign assistance. And you said, yeah. And I agree that lethal assistance was very significant, as you said. And I thank you for that. And I thank Mr. Volker, and I thank Mr. Taylor. Acting Ambassador Taylor was here Wednesday. He testified about the president's decision to withhold lethal aid. And he said the president felt it might provoke Russia. And Mr. Taylor contested then that Russia has already been provoked and they have invaded the Ukraine.
This is just like Phil. I mean, it's really quite. It's fascinating stuff, and it's fascinating to hear Republicans like this guy, trying to.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interagency process, and obviously
trying to find some little thread that they can pull on, but there's just like no threads. I mean, Trump committed a crime here, and she suffered for it.
As do all presidents, correct?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And what's truly astonishing is she got the phone call to say, Trump wants you out of there, when she was at a ceremony for a woman who'd had acid thrown on her, who died from that for fighting corruption.
We have another president, Trump, who vetted those that were going to receive the aid and provided it consistent with your intra-agency recommendations and that of your colleagues. Let me just ask you from a military standpoint, without javelins, would you agree the Russians had much greater military offensive options and flexibility in their effort to attack the Ukraine without the Ukraine having javelins?
Yeah, I mean, they had another option, although the tank war is no longer the war that is being fought in Ukraine.
But I'm just saying, with the javelin.
Yeah, it's another option.
And there's a reason for that, because the javelins are there. And so I think that changes the scenario. But I just wanted to make that point, that the president has a right to have their own foreign policy and to make their own decisions. And with that, I yield back.
Yeah. If I could just supplement one of my answers.
Of course.
So I want to thank you for your service as well. But what I'd like to say is, while I obviously don't dispute that the president has the right to withdraw an ambassador at any time for any reason, but what I do wonder is why it was necessary to smear my reputation.
Well, I wasn't asking about that, but thank you very much, ma'am.
Representative Speer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, so very much.
This is Congresswoman Jackie Speer, and she is going to be
yes.
good.
So unanimous, Republicans and Democrats, correct?
Yes.
No dispute. You said that in summer of 2018, the smear campaign began in your testimony earlier today. Did Secretary Pompeo at any time come to your aid?
Well, my understanding from Assistant Secretary Phil Reeker and Deputy Secretary Sullivan is that, this sort of the rumors about me, if, for lack of a better word, the smear campaign, which was behind closed doors at that point, that there were a number of discussions between the President and Secretary Pompeo, and that he actually did keep me in place for as long as he could. That's what I was told.
So it appears that back in 2018, the President was already making noises that he wanted you out of there. It appears that as early as April of 2018, Mr. Parnas was at a fundraiser for the President and recommended that you be removed. And then subsequently, in May of 2018, was pictured at a White House dinner with the President, and then later in May made a contribution of over $325,000 illegally to the President's reelection campaign. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of the press about those things.
Does that help you understand a little bit more why this smear campaign was underway?
Yes, I mean...
All right, you made some very riveting comments in your statement this morning that I just want to repeat because I think we should have you expand on it. You said, "I've always understood that I served at the pleasure of the President. I still find it difficult to comprehend that foreign and private interests were able to undermine U.S. interests in this way. Individuals who apparently felt stymied by our efforts to promote stated U.S. policy against corruption, that is, to do our mission, were able to successfully conduct a campaign of disinformation against a sitting ambassador using unofficial back channels." Now, as I listened to you make that statement, I was thinking of all the other persons in the Foreign Service who now have to be concerned that it's not good enough to follow the stated U.S. foreign policy, but also to be aware that maybe the President has a back channel of interests that he is promoting that is diametrically opposed to our stated foreign policy. Can you expand on that, please?
Well, I think that it's important that whoever is representing the President, an ambassador, speaks with the full authority of the President and our foreign policy establishment. And if there are others who are also helping with the responsibilities in that country, for example, Ambassador Kurt Volker with his important mission to bring peace to the Donbass, that we all speak with one voice, that it's all about our common security interest, and that it's not about, personal gain or commercial gain or anything else, that it's about our national security.
But in this case, the Tres Amigos appeared
we
to be more
are listening to
interested
Jackie
in getting an
Speer
investigation
questioning the Democrat,
than into promoting
questioning
an anti-corruption
Ambassador
effort
Yovanovitch
in Ukraine. Is that correct?
That appears to be the case.
You were told at one point in 2019, in February earlier this year, you spoke to a minister in Ukraine who warned that when it came to Rudy Giuliani, you needed to, quote, watch your back. What did you understand him to mean?
I didn't exactly know, but you know, the rumor was out there at that time, and in fact, I think this minister also shared that information with me that the mayor was working to have me removed.
Let me just say, to conclude, that you have endured an orchestrated character assassination, that it was hatched over 1.5 years ago, and that it's laced with enormous campaign contributions to the president's reelection campaign. And you deserve more from the American people, and you deserve more from Congress in supporting you. I yield back.
I have unanimous consent.
Mr. Stewart, you're recognized.
I have unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman.
We could take that up later. Mr. Stewart, you're recognized.
Oh, so we're back to another Republican, and you know, so far it seems like the Republican strategy has been to just ask, you know, namby-pamby boring questions, or you know, hey, it's nice to see you here, and let's talk about some minutia, to basically get people to turn off their TVs or go away. We'll see if this guy does it. If it does, I'll probably interrupt him more than I might otherwise.
Accusations that we now know are absolute nonsense. There was no basis at all, despite promises from
This is Chris Stewart, Republican from Utah.
Secret proof that would prove this collusion, and again, we know that it was nonsense. But now in year 4, we apparently move on to Ukraine and quid pro quo, culminating yesterday when the Speaker announced that the President would indeed be impeached and removed for office for bribery. And with that statement, I would now feel compelled to ask you, Madam Ambassador, as you sit here before us, very simply and directly, do you have any information regarding the President of the United States accepting any bribes?
No.
Do you have any information regarding any criminal activity that the President of the United States has been involved with at all?
No.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that directly. The American people know this is nonsense. The American people know this is unfair. And I have a prediction regarding this. I think that public support for impeachment is actually going to be less when these hearings are over than it is when the hearings began. Because finally, the American people are going to be able to see the evidence. And they're going to be able to make their own determination regarding that. Now, I want to ask you one thing very quickly.
This is very, very interesting.
Again and again, but my question is slightly different.
They're building a case.
Any president has
well, I'll summarize it when we come back.
Ask his ambassadors.
It's the Thom Hartmann Program. We're listening to the impeachment.
I'm curious, do you think that's the right policy?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Yeah, I probably think it is.
I do as well. It may be imperfect. There may be times when it's not used perfectly. But I agree with you. It is the right policy. I don't think that we should change that. Now, I'd like to read from some previous statements, including one of your own as well as others, regarding the appropriateness of investigating corruption in the UK. From Ms. Fiona Hill. So again, the fact that there are investigations into corruption in the energy sector in Ukraine, as well as Russia and many other countries, is not a surprise. From yourself, your previous testimony. Question. Was it the general understanding that Burisma was a company that suffered from allegations of corruption? Your answer was yes. From Ambassador Sondland, I just am generally aware that Burisma is considered a potentially corrupt company. Would you agree then that it's appropriate to investigate corruption?
I think it's appropriate if it's part of our national strategy. What I would say is that we have a process for doing that. It's called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. We have one with Ukraine, and generally it goes from our Department of Justice to the Ministry of Justice in the country of interest.
Okay,
and that's the usual path.
And I appreciate that. Regardless of the process, though, it's appropriate for us to investigate in potential corruption. And especially, look, we're about to give some of these countries hundreds of millions of dollars. The U.S. taxpayer said, here's $1 of mine, go ahead and give it to this other country. But please only do it if you know it's not going to be used for corrupt purposes or against our national interest. And I'll conclude with this, because I promised my friend, Mr. Jordan, I would save him a little bit of time. We mentioned earlier that the vice president, when he went to the Ukraine and called for the specific firing of a specific prosecutor, that he was, as they say, completing official U.S. policy. But the interesting thing is this. The vice president had exactly 2 countries that were his responsibility at that time, China and the Ukraine. And he has bragged and been very proud of his influence in the previous administration. He says again and again that the Obama administration listened to him, so it doesn't surprise me that they would be fulfilling a policy that this vice president certainly helped to formulate. Mr. Jordan, I leave you.
Sir, if you just want to clarify, it was Cyprus and Ukraine, not China.
In Cyprus, I'm sorry. Thank you. Clarification, and I will yield for unanimous consent.
I have unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that doesn't involve you this time. It's 3 articles, a New York Times article, 2004 campaign. The advisors, Kerry Foreign Policy Crew has a Clintonian
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Kiev Post, Holbrooke to visit Kiev, July 2004. And the Brahma News, Richard Holbrooke meets with one Ukrainian
Gentleman's
American
time has expired.
organization. I'd like to have that unanimous
Mr. Quigley,
consent,
you're
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman.
Mr. Quigley, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. It's like a Hallmark movie. You ended up at Georgetown. This is all okay. But it wasn't your preference 7, 8 months ago, correct?
No, it was not.
Wasn't your preference to be the victim of a smear campaign, was it?
No.
Wasn't your preference to be defamed by the President of the United States, including today, was it?
No.
Wasn't your preference to be ousted at seemingly the pinnacle of your career, was it?
No.
You wanted to finish your extended tour, correct?
I did.
What did you want to do after that? Did you know?
I wasn't sure.
There's nothing wrong with Georgetown. It's a fine place, right?
It's a wonderful place.
But it's your only choice at the end of a distinguished career after all that. It's not the end of a Hallmark movie. It's the end of a really bad reality TV show brought to you by someone who knows a lot about that. Why did you previously testified that you sought advice from Ambassador Sondland at this time about what to do. Is that correct?
I did.
And why did you reach out to the ambassador?
Because this was clearly so political and was not going to be, you know, the State Department was not in a position, shall we say, to manage the issue. It didn't appear to me. And so I asked Ambassador Sondland, who said that he, you know, he was a political appointee. He said he was close to the president. And so he had just been in Ukraine for a ship visit with some of his EU colleagues from Brussels. And so I reached out to him for advice. When this was no longer a Ukraine kind of an interview with Mr. Lutsenko, kind of a Ukrainian, but it became sort of the American politicians and pundits, et cetera, were repeating those allegations. I asked him for advice.
And it meant a lot to you. This was an extraordinary time. It meant, and the advice meant a lot. And what was his advice?
Well, he suggested that I needed to go big or go home, and he said that the best thing to do would be to, you know, send out a tweet, praise the president, that sort of thing.
And what was your reaction to that advice?
Well, my reaction was that I'm sure he meant well, but it was not advice that I could really follow. It felt, it felt partisan, it felt political, and I just, that was not something that I thought was in keeping with my role as ambassador and a foreign service officer.
Did he give you any specific suggestions on what to say about the President of the United States, or just say something nice about him?
Yeah, just to praise him.
Thank you. I yield the balance to the chairman.
I want to follow up on Ms. Quigley's line of question and also harken back to something you were asked by Minority Counsel earlier. You were asked a couple of questions. Do you think you could have done more to push back against this smear campaign? And I'm not suggesting this is what the counsel was getting at, but sometimes victims are asked, aren't you responsible for your own victimization? What would you say to people who say, isn't it kind of your fault, Ambassador, that you didn't fight your own smear harder?
Well, I think that, I've been a Foreign Service officer for a long time. And just like the military, we have our own culture, we have our own kind of chain of command, so to speak. And I did everything that I could to address these issues and ask the State Department to do what I felt was the right thing, which was support me when it was important to do so, because it was also about supporting the policy. I think it was for others to stand up for me.
I quite agree. Representative Stefanik.
Thank you. Since the chairman has gavelled out all of my colleagues with their unanimous consent, I am going to read for the record many of the chairman's comments in September of the importance of hearing from the
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your
Listening to the testimony of Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. This is Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik, the Republican from Crazyville.
This is a quote by the chairman. USA Today, September 29th. Talking with ABC News this week, Schiff, the Democrat who chairs the House Intelligence Committee, said the whistleblower would testify very soon. And the only thing standing in the way was getting security clearances for the attorneys representing the whistleblower so they could attend the testimony. From Vox, September 29th, Rep. Adam Schiff said Sunday the whistleblower at the center of a growing scandal surrounding President Donald Trump will testify before the House Intelligence Committee very soon. On CNN, September 29th, Schiff said Sunday on ABC as well as NBC's Meet the Press that he expects the whistleblower to testify very soon. The Washington Post, September 29th. In an appearance on ABC News this week, Schiff echoed Pelosi's message. He also said he expected the Intelligence Committee to hear from the whistleblower very soon, pending a security clearance from Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph McGuire. In the Huffington Post, Schiff told ABC's this week that he expects the whistleblower to appear before this committee very soon. In the New York Post, quote, we'll get the unfiltered testimony of that whistleblower. In the Washington Times, quote, that whistleblower will be allowed to come in. These are all quotes from Chairman Adam Schiff. In Talking Points memo, the question was posed, actually this was by George Stephanopoulos, have you reached an agreement yet with the whistleblower and his or her attorneys about coming before the committee and providing the information firsthand? Quote, yes, we have, Schiff responded, and as DNI McGuire promised during the hearing, that whistleblower will be allowed to come in and come in without a minder from the Justice Department or from the White House to tell the whistleblower what they can and cannot say. We'll get the unfiltered testimony of that whistleblower. In Daily Kos,
this is, as I said, Elise Stefanik. She's actually from New York, not Crazyville. She just sounds like she's from Crazyville. What she's trying to do basically is attack Adam Schiff, number one, and number two, say we need to bring the whistleblower in front of us so that we can give him the Christine Blasey Ford treatment, so that we can out this person, so that we can make sure that this person gets death threats, so that no other whistleblowers will come forward to confront the Trump administration. I
put these into the record
defer
with
back
unanimous
to
consent. So I've
Ms.
read those
Stefanik,
out, and as we know,
Crazyville.
it is important to protect whistleblowers from retaliation and from firing, and we want to make sure whistleblowers are able to come forward. But in this case, the fact that we are getting criticized by Chairman Adam Schiff for statements that he himself made early on in this process shows the duplicity and just the abuse of power that we are continuing to see. With a minute 54 seconds left, I'll yield to my colleague, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I would also
This is now Jim Jordan, a Republican from Pitbullville.
There's 4 people we've deposed that we have not been able to see their transcripts, have their transcripts released, and therefore the testimony they provided we're not able to use in these open hearings. If it's an open hearing, all the available testimony from depositions that has been taken by the committee should be available to be discussed for the American people to see. But no. Mr. Morris and Mr. Hale and two other, Ms. Williams, two others have, and another one have not yet been released. So I hope the chairman releases that. One other point I would make in the last minute of Ms. Stefanik's time. The Democrats have asserted that this whole thing,
huffing and puffing here,
Ambassador Yovanovitch, was part of some sinister scheme by the White House.
Yes, it was.
To get Mr. Zelensky to do an investigation, President Zelensky to do an investigation. If recalling Ambassador Yovanovitch was part of some scheme by Trump and Pompeo and Giuliani to get President Zelensky to do an investigation, why would they replace her with the Democrats' first witness, their star witness, Bill Taylor? I mean, if that's the
well,
plan,
they tried to push Taylor out of the way and insert
Sondland.
I mean, that's a simple
their
answer.
Star witness, their first witness, Mr. Taylor, was here Wednesday. That's what they were up to? I think it just demonstrates that that is not what went on here. Mr. Zelensky never undertook any investigations, and the reason the aid was released, as we discussed on Wednesday, was because Vice President Pence, Ambassador Bolton, and U.S. senators all talked with President Zelensky, and they were convinced he was the real deal, as the ambassador has alluded to in her testimony. That's why the money was released.
Yeah, no, the money was released, or the military aid was released.
Chairman, a lot
because 2 days earlier, the American media had laid out the whistleblower.
Most of
Anyhow,
what the
here's Eric
whistleblower has
Swalwell,
alleged has
Democrat
been
from
corroborated
California.
by the witnesses that we have heard from. Second, the president, who my colleagues so shamelessly continue to defend, continue to pressure, threaten, and intimidate the whistleblower. So I'd like unanimous consent to put into the record a September 26, 2019 article from Business Insider. Trump suggested the whistleblower who filed a complaint against him is guilty of treason, which is punishable by death.
Without objection.
How about September 26, 2019, Vanity Fair? Trump suggests executing the whistleblower's sources, like, quote, in the good old days. Third,
without objection.
September 29th, whistleblower's lawyer raises fear for client safety.
Without objection.
From Axios. Mr. Chairman, the whistleblower has an absolute right to anonymity. The whistleblower's lawyer has said that he fears for his personal safety and will only answer questions now in writing. I wish my colleagues would join me in protecting the whistleblower's right to anonymity. But here, Ms. Yovanovitch, we are here to talk about you and what you witnessed. And you saw a lot as it related to Mr. Giuliani. And I want to read a quote to you from Mr. Giuliani, but first ask you, when you were in Ukraine, you understood that Rudy Giuliani was Donald Trump's personal lawyer. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Are you familiar with Rudy Giuliani's quote in the New York Times describing himself as the lawyer, saying, quote, he basically knows what I'm doing, comma, sure, as his lawyer. Were you familiar with that quote?
It sounds familiar.
And you have a lawyer with you today, Ms. Yovanovitch. And you understand that lawyers act on their client's behalf, is that right?
Yes.
That it would be improper for a lawyer to go outside any directive that a client gives, is that right?
That's my understanding.
Are you familiar with a New York Times story on May 9, 2019, where Rudy Giuliani says that he intends to visit Ukraine and says, we're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation. Are you familiar with that quote?
Yes.
That's 11 days before you were removed as ambassador, is that right?
Yes.
He is talking publicly about designs on coming to Ukraine. But what I think is interesting is that Mr. Giuliani says, we're, as in we are. He doesn't say, I am not meddling in an election. He doesn't say, I'm not meddling in an investigation. He says, we. He's speaking for himself and his client. And I want to talk about that quote, we're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation. Is it proper for you or anyone who acts on behalf of the United States government to meddle in an investigation?
No, I don't believe so.
Why not?
Well, there are law enforcement channels, and things need to be handled properly and without any kind of political bias.
Now, this anti-corruption crusader, President Trump, who my colleagues have touted out as having such a great interest in anti-corruption, in both the calls that have been referenced today, the August 21 call and the July 25 call, isn't it true that President Trump never mentions the word corruption?
Yes, that's true.
And as far as the foreign aid that my colleagues keep saying, well, he can't be guilty, he didn't complete the cheat, the aid went to the Ukrainians, isn't it true that the only reason the aid, or the only time the aid went to the Ukrainians, was after the whistleblower complaint became public?
Yes, it was after the whistleblower complaint became public.
So you don't really get points when you get your hand caught in the cookie jar and someone says, hey, he's got his hand in the cookie jar, and then you take your hand out, which is essentially what my Republican colleagues and the president are trying to take credit for. Finally, I want to put up the disgusting tweet from the president today, where he attacks your character. But I think I know who you are, Ambassador. I think the country knows who you are. He smeared you when you were in Ukraine. He smeared you on that phone call with President Zelensky on July 25. He is smearing you right now as you are testifying. Ambassador Yovanovitch, are the president's smears going to stop you from fighting corruption?
Well, I will continue with my work.
And if your country asks you again to fight corruption, will you still do that despite the smears?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Hurt.
This is fascinating. So now it's going to another Republican, so I'm going to hit a break here. We'll be back. It's going to be Will Hurd from Texas. You know, I think we've kind of figured out the whole Republican strategy here. Eric Swalwell, that was just absolutely brilliant. He was making the points that I've been riffing about here, and made them very, very well. And they just need to be made over and over and over again. It's 16 minutes past the hour. We're listening to the impeachment hearings.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Former Ukrainian Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch is testifying. The fellow who followed her as current ambassador testified day before yesterday. Mr. Taylor.
In service, you are an honor to this country, and I thank you for all that you have done and will continue to do on behalf of your country. Now, I'm nervous about what I'm getting ready to do. I want to do a 5-year history of Ukraine in about 45 seconds. And now that you're a professor, you can grade my paper, okay? Valentine's Day 2014, the Ukrainian people get fed up with the Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, and basically overthrow him. He goes on the run. This was the revolution of dignity. Who was the acting president during that time when Yanukovych went out?
I think it was...
Turchinov, is that how you say it?
Turchinov, thank you for helping me.
Turchinov, okay, excellent. Then in March of 2014, that is when we saw little green men coming into Ukraine, and ultimately the Russians invade the Ukraine and not only try to annex Crimea, but also they invade the entire country in the eastern Donbass as well.
Yes.
Then there was an election, and the Ukrainian president was Poroshenko. That was in June of 2014. Then you came to post in 2016 of August, is that correct?
2 years later.
January 2017, Trump was elected. And in December of 2017 is when the javelins were approved, right? And we saw those javelins delivered in April of 2018 to be put to first use. Then we had Zelensky elected in 2019, April, correct? Now, the Zelensky defeated the previous president, Poroshenko.
Yes.
There's no love lost between those two dudes, is there?
I don't think so.
Okay. And then in May of 2019, Zelensky is sworn in.
Yes.
So my questions, we talk a lot about Rudy Giuliani. Do we know what officials within the Zelensky regime he actually met with? I know two. A gentleman named by Yermak, who was one of Zelensky's senior advisors. And then we also know of the former attorney general that we've already established here, was corrupt, Lutsenko, right? And Mr. Lushenko served under Zelensky for a couple of months, up until August, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And their parliament basically voted him out, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So if Rudy Giuliani is trying to influence the Zelensky regime, would a guy that worked under the previous regime, under Poroshenko, be the right guy to do it?
So are you saying Mr. Lutsenko?
Yes.
That he, could you
Did Mr. Lutsenko have much credibility within the Zelensky regime, the current regime?
I don't think so.
He didn't. Now, Mr. Yermak, do you know of any other Ukrainians that Mr. Giuliani was meeting with that was part of the Zelensky regime?
Well, just to remind, I would have already have left Ukraine by that point.
But there was
no, I'm not aware.
Even with the administration to come, right? Zelensky won the election. There was a 2-month period of preparing to be installed as president. Even during that time, were you aware of any contact?
There was, so there is one of the oligarchs, as we've heard about. One of the oligarchs is named Mr. Kolomoisky, and he met with Mr. Fruman and Mr. Parnas, and that was apparently to get a meeting for Mr. Giuliani.
And but those are not people that were actually in government or became in the Zelensky regime, is that correct?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your 33 years of service to our nation. A big question here today is why you were pushed aside as ambassador. For example, Americans know that an employer has a right to fire an employee, but they shouldn't do it for certain reasons. You shouldn't be fired because you're disabled, because you're a woman, because you're black, and for other reasons. And I think most Americans agree that a president shouldn't fire an ambassador or recall an ambassador because the ambassador is standing in his way of doing a corrupt act. So I want to ask you, did the president ever tell you why he was recalling you?
No.
Did anybody at the White House ever tell you why you were being recalled?
No.
Did the president ever consult you about who the good guys and the bad guys were in the Ukraine?
No.
Did Secretary Pompeo ever tell you why you were being recalled?
No.
And it appears in the testimony that we've heard in the Intelligence Committee so far that there were a group of the president's men, perhaps Secretary Perry, Rudy Giuliani, Ambassador Sondland, who were in on this scheme to help the president get the Bidens and Burisma investigated.
The Democrat.
And I want to put aside President Trump for just a second and ask you, in all of your years of service, have you ever come across a president, been asked by a president, or known of colleagues who were asked by an American president to help that president get an American investigated overseas?
I'm not aware of that.
And if a president asked you to investigate a former vice president for this purpose, what would you have said?
I mean, with what I know today, I would have said no.
And would you have considered it an unlawful act?
I don't know that it's unlawful per se, but I think, again, that there are channels for conducting proper investigations, and that would have been the best way to handle something like this.
But certainly it's bizarre for a president to ask that some American be investigated by another government.
It's very unusual.
And also, you mentioned that there is corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine isn't the only country that confronts corruption. If the people in power in a country where corruption is rampant are being asked by a foreign leader who's got a lot of leverage over them to conduct an investigation, could that be dangerous because they could trump up charges against someone if they wanted?
They could.
And I also want to ask you, I spoke to Ambassador Kent. He made a comment yesterday about selective prosecutions and what it means going forward, what kind of precedent it sets. And you've spoken about a dangerous precedent for the State Department and for diplomats. But I want you to help us consider the precedent going forward. If there's no consequences for President Trump, or really any president who does this, what are the consequences for this country and for any American, not just a former vice president or a presidential candidate or even somebody in politics, but a person in business who does business in Saudi Arabia or some other country? If a president is going to speak to another head of state or some foreign official and try to get that person investigated, what does that mean for the future of the country and for Americans?
Well, I think that investigations, prosecutions, judicial decisions properly should remain with investigators, prosecutors, and the courts. And I think that, as I said before, I think Senator Vandenberg, when he said that politics needs to stop at the water's edge, I think he was right in that.
I'll yield back to the chairman.
Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank the chairman, and Ambassador Yovanovitch, I'd like to join all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in thanking you for your service. I'd like to ask you about your earlier testimony about your Senate confirmation, and Congresswoman Stefanik had asked you how the Obama-Biden State Department had prepared you to
This is John Ratcliffe, Republican Texas, who was pretty aggressive in his questioning of Taylor and Kent.
She mentioned that you had been asked or been prepared for a question about Hunter Biden's role on the board of Burisma, but I don't think that you gave us
we're back to Hunter Biden, of course. It's a Republican asking the questions.
State
Hunter
Department
Biden.
prepared you to give in response to that question. Do you remember what those answers were?
Yeah, it was something along the lines of, I would refer you to the Vice President's office on that.
So did they, in the course of that, brief you about the amount of money that Hunter Biden was being paid by Burisma?
No, this wasn't part of a briefing.
Let's be sure to get this on the record, too.
I had sort of big old books with questions that might come up.
In preparation for your confirmation. And they thought that Hunter Biden's role at Burisma might be significant enough that it would come up during your confirmation. Is that correct?
Apparently so. I mean, there were hundreds of questions.
Well, hundreds of questions, but were there hundreds of companies? How many companies other than Burisma?
They are grasping at straws, I'm telling you. We'll be back in just a minute.
For? And if so, if there were others,
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're
listening to the testimony of U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch.
You know, this is a while ago.
Before the impeachment hearings.
But you specifically recall Burisma?
Yes.
All right. Out of thousands of companies in the Ukraine, the only one that you recall the Obama-Biden State Department preparing you to answer questions about was the one where the vice president's son was on the board. Is that fair?
Yes.
You understood from Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent's testimony, as it's been related to you, that he testified a few days ago. Do you understand that that arrangement, Hunter Biden's role on the Burisma board, caused him enough concern that, as he testified in his statement, that in February of 2015, I raised my concern that Hunter Biden's status as a board member could create the perception of a conflict of interest. He went on to talk about the vice president's responsibilities over the Ukraine or over Ukrainian policy as one of those factors. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
That it was a legitimate concern to raise?
I think that it could raise the appearance of a conflict of interest.
And did you discuss that ever with Mr. Kent?
I don't believe so.
Shortly before your confirmation in August of 2016, Prosecutor General Shokin was fired by President Poroshenko, correct?
Yes.
And Prosecutor General Shokin was the one who had opened the investigation into Burisma, correct?
I think that's right, but I'm not actually sure.
He was in charge of it, at least at that point in time, as the Prosecutor General. And are you aware of the very public statements by the Vice President that firing of the Prosecutor General occurred in March of 2016, 6 hours after the Vice President told President Poroshenko that he needed to fire the Prosecutor General or that he wouldn't receive $1 billion from the United States? Do you recall that?
Yes.
All right. And do you think that raises a potential concern or conflict of interest that the Vice President of the United States was ordering the firing of the prosecutor in charge of a company that has been identified as one that is substantially corrupt?
I actually don't. I don't think that the view that Mr. Shokin was not a good prosecutor general fighting corruption, I don't think that had anything to do with the Burisma case.
But the legitimate concern about Hunter Biden's role was legitimate, correct?
I think it creates a concern that there could be an appearance of
well, based on your testimony, Ambassador, I'd like to renew my request, Mr. Chairman, that Hunter Biden's testimony that has been requested.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Requested by the Republicans be considered as legitimate rather than as a sham, as the
gentleman was
referred to by the chairman.
Your time has expired.
I have a unanimous.
Mr. Heck,
I have a unanimous consent request.
You're not recognized, Mr. Heck. You are.
Ambassador, I'd like to thank you very much. Add my voice of gratitude for your years of service. Frankly, you're the best of this nation, and I cannot think of anybody else I would rather have representing us in a foreign capital than you. My colleagues have gone to a great deal of effort to better understand the facts surrounding your removal. I think the facts are pretty clear. There was a smear campaign, and it was orchestrated by a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor, the president's attorney, the president's son, and even some of the president's allies at his favorite TV station. So that campaign led to your removal, despite 33 years of outstanding service, progressive responsibility, and awards. And so I kind of sit here with a mix of emotions. On the one hand, there's some pride and gratitude for all your outstanding service, and on the other hand, I'm angry, like my friend from Connecticut. In fact, I'm very angry about how it is the most powerful person on the face of the earth would remove you from office after your stellar service and somehow feel compelled to characterize you as bad news and then to ominously threaten that you're going to go through some things. So I am angry, but I'm not surprised. After all, as was suggested earlier, he said the whistleblower may have committed treason, a crime punishable by death, even though the whistleblower strictly adhered to the letter of the law as independently attested to by both the Trump-appointed Inspector General and the acting DNI. After all, he even demeaned the memory of Senator McCain after he lied in his grave at the Naval Academy grounds, despite a lifetime of public service and serving 6 years as a prisoner of war in a tiny cell in Hanoi, being beaten and tortured every day. And after all, he belittled the Gold Star Khan family, whose son, Captain Khan, gave his last full measure of devotion out of love for this country. And let me tell you, as somebody whose older brother never saw his 35th birthday because of service in the Vietnam War, those words are deeply offensive. Words matter, and the words leveled against you constitute bullying of the worst order. Your good character, your outstanding reputation have been besmirched in a way that is devoid of common decency. But here's my message to you. There is nothing, Ambassador Yovanovitch, nothing he can say or do, not a thing, that will in any way diminish the nature and quality of the service you have rendered to our great nation. Not a thing. And there is not a thing he can say or do that will diminish our gratitude to you for that service. and I thank you again for it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as to the larger point, I would like you to answer, what does this mean to Ukraine when the United States actually engages in the kind of behavior that we are attempting to discourage them from engaging in, namely a politically motivated prosecution? What does that mean to what does that mean to them in their struggling efforts to become a robust democracy? What's the impact in Ukraine for this behavior?
Yeah. Well, I think Ukraine, like many countries, looks to us for the power of our example. And I think that when we engage in questionable activities, that
this
raises
is
a
Congressman
question.
Denny Hecht
And
questioning Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch.
It emboldens
He's a Democrat.
those who are corrupt, who don't want to see Ukraine become
Washington State.
You know, a democracy, a free market economy, a part of Europe.
And by the way, he just
want
finished just
Ukraine to
ripping
stay
into
in,
Donald Trump for dishonoring
under Russia's thrall.
John McCain's
And
service
that's
to the
not in
country
our
and
national
the Gold Star family, the Khan family. And he pointed out that his own older brother died at the age of 35 in Vietnam, and he's very bent out of shape about the horrible way that Trump treated John McCain.
Let's take a 5-minute recess. If members of the audience could please remain in the seats to allow
isn't just 5 minutes.
counsel to...
So, you know, it's Anything Goes Friday here. If you've got thoughts on this, feel free to give us a shout at 202-808-9925. And Marie Yovanovitch has been testifying. This is just absolutely remarkable. I mean, you know, some pieces of this story are just like breathtaking. There was a young woman in Ukraine who was attacked with sulfuric acid because she was crusading against corruption. Right? She was fighting corruption. And she has this acid thrown on her. She dies a horrible, painful death. And Marie Yovanovitch apparently knew her. And this woman dies, and then Yovanovitch is holding basically a ceremony to memorialize her and honor her. And by the way, if you just tried to call, give us a shout again, 202-808-9925. She's in there to honor her, and this is when she gets this phone call that Trump wants you out. We also learned, or one of the things that I learned here, and like the timeline is getting filled in, is that early in the Trump administration, very early on in the Trump administration, there was when Poroshenko was still president. Now, keep in mind, Poroshenko was kind of the in-between guy. There was Yanukovych, who was, insanely corrupt. He was Paul Manafort's guy. In fact, when Yanukovych got overthrown, that was the revolution of dignity. When Yanukovych got overthrown, that's how we found out about some of, the stuff that Paul Manafort's sitting in jail for right now for tax evasion, because that's where the diaries came out that showed all the millions of dollars that was being paid to him off the books by the Yanukovych government. So he gets overthrown, and he flees to Russia, and he gets replaced by Mr. Poroshenko, who was kind of positioned as a reformer, but he still had this corrupt prosecutor and really wasn't that much of a reformer, but he was better, and he was on the U.S. side at least. And so, and during that period in time, as Trump gets elected president, we deliver the first delivery of Javelin missiles, these anti-tank missiles. And there's also some evidence, and this is the stuff that I've been talking about this for several days now, and there's a great piece about this over at TPM, that Poroshenko was receiving these missiles because he actually had made a commitment that come election year, sometime late this year, early next year, if he was still president, that he would launch the investigation into Joe Biden and Burisma and Hunter Biden and all that kind of stuff, and you know, dirty up the Democratic candidate, just like had happened with Jim Comey investigating Hillary Clinton. And Trump expected it to have the same result, tearing down Joe Biden. And frankly, it is. I mean, Ambassador Yovanovitch, today was asked by several Republicans, well, do you think it looks bad that the vice president's son is getting 50 grand a month on a board of a corrupt foreign, Ukrainian gas company? And she said, yeah, I think it looks bad. I think it looks bad. I think we all think it looks bad. Hunter Biden exercised terrible judgment, and his father should have stopped him. That doesn't mean that Joe Biden shouldn't become president or shouldn't be the Democratic nominee. But I have a feeling that's one of the things that is hurting Joe Biden to the point that the donor class now, they're looking for a corporate-friendly Democrat to run against Warren and Sanders, and they're not quite sure that Pete Buttigieg is the guy because he's basically just been the mayor of a small town in Indiana. And he's never had a presidential campaign dig up dirt on him. He's never had that level and intensity of scrutiny before. And nobody knows if he'll be able to withstand it. So, Deval Patrick, he worked at Bain Capital for Mitt Romney. And he was the Democratic governor of Massachusetts. So, and he's very, very wealthy from working at Bain. He was multi-millionaire. So let's bring him in. And then, of course, Bloomberg jumps in. But anyhow, I digress. But this is where we're at. And the Republicans are just constantly going back to that, like we don't know it already. I mean, yeah, we know. Hunter Biden was there. He shouldn't have been there. It's not like he was taking bribes. It's not like he was ordering people hit. It's not like, but he shouldn't have been there. Sure. Point made. But Donald Trump was trying to corrupt an entire government of a country that is allied to the United States and shares our interests. This is just absolutely breathtaking. Anyhow, I'll pick up some of your phone calls here. George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Two quick things, Tom. First, there's no doubt that between the time the appropriation and the missiles should have been released to Ukraine and the time they finally got there.
Which was 2 days after the whistleblowers stuff was publicized, yes.
Yeah. Ukrainian military people and civilians died at a higher rate than they would have if the military had had that very effective weapon.
That's correct.
Without getting into the technical details, there's nothing Russian armor fears more except possibly helicopter gunships. But this puts a weapon in the hands of an infantryman that can take out the biggest, hardest to kill tank.
Yeah, and if I can jump in here, George, if the tables were turned and the Republicans were prosecuting a Democratic president under identical circumstances, they would, like they did with that woman in San Francisco who got, when the illegal immigrant, in quotes, undocumented guy here in the United States dropped a gun in San Francisco and it discharged and killed this woman. And I'm sorry, I don't remember her name. Anybody who watches Fox News could immediately tell you who she is because they did.
Yeah, it happened on a pier that was popular with tourists.
That's right. That's right. What the Republicans would have done is they would have found the name of one of those Ukrainian civilians or soldiers who died in the conflict with Russia. And they would have, and that person's picture and name and face would be all over the media all the time saying, this is who, the president killed. Anyhow, back to you, George.
And anyway, and that's in connection with my next point, which is what's often discussed on your program is how ineffective the Democrats continue to be on imaging and messaging.
Yeah, which is kind of the point I was just making.
And secondly, Republicans for years and years have been just delighted to remind us all that elections have consequences.
Right.
Well, I think every Democrat, particularly the members of the House and the Speaker, every time the Republicans start whining about this procedure that's going on, should look them right in the eye and say, elections have consequences. The people elected a solid Democratic majority in the House to do exactly what we're doing. Yeah. Elections have consequences.
Absolutely, George. And by the way, let's not forget that if but for, 25 or thereabouts Democrats getting elected over Republicans in the last election, in the election of 2018, had the Democrats not taken the House of Representatives starting in January of this year, these hearings wouldn't be going on.
Exactly.
All this stuff would have been buried. Trump would have gotten away with it. In fact, they would probably be announcing. Well, he would have announced. I mean, Fareed Zakaria, his op-ed in, I believe it was yesterday's Washington Post, came right out and said, this guy, Zelensky was going to announce this on my show. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And I would also add that the way things have turned out are a total ratification of the leadership of Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah,
it was
I think so.
Her leadership and strategy that gained this majority, and she stage managed this impeachment process with perfect effectiveness. And every Democrat, even those who don't like her, should stand up and cheer.
Yeah, I agree, George. Well said. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day. Well, we're talking about Marie Yovanovitch's testimony, which is paused right now. It's a 5-minute pause, which means it'll be 15 minutes. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And I'll be back with your calls and my thoughts, and we're just kind of processing this right now. Stick around. And welcome back. Tom in Aurora, Colorado. Hey, Tom, what's up? What's on your mind?
To hear from you. I was just curious. I keep thinking ahead to something I saw, and that is the fact that Mitch McConnell has already stated that he essentially doesn't see this impeachment as an issue that's going to have to be followed up on in the Senate, really. I mean, yes,
well, no, he has
Senate,
said that he will hold a hearing.
Yeah, I mean, where are we headed with this is, I guess, the real question.
Yeah. If your question is, can Mitch McConnell pretend this doesn't exist like he did with the nomination of Merrick Garland, although both are prescribed in the Constitution, I don't think he can get away with that. He's going to have to hold a hearing, and a trial, actually, and John Roberts is going to come over and supervise it. The big question is, are these hearings, is this process going to be able to convince 20 Republican senators that Donald Trump is a criminal and should be removed from office? And I'm not, I keep waiting. I have a feeling, and Tom, thank you for the call. I have a feeling that when it goes, when the dike breaks, when the dam breaks, it's going to break really fast. And you're going to just see an avalanche of Republicans suddenly turning their backs on Trump. And the thing that tells me that that's probably what's going to happen is that the majority of the Republicans who are asking questions today were not going after this witness in a strong way. Will in Las Vegas, Nevada. Hey, Will, what's up?
Hey, Tom. First of all, I want to point out, I had the opportunity of going to Kyiv in October of 2017, and while I was there, I marched in the Defenders Day March, which was an amazing spectacle.
Wow.
But the one thing drives me nuts, and I can guarantee you drives every Ukrainian listening to this nuts, is the Republicans' insistence of calling it the Ukraine.
Right, which is, and the means it's a portion of Russia.
Right, or some other country.
Yeah.
And it's very, it would be the equivalent of somebody calling us the British colonies today.
Yeah. The Ukraine is short for the Ukrainian region of Russia, or of the Soviet Union, rather. Excuse me.
Right, and I can guarantee you, well, I was there. It took me a while to break that habit because that's how we were taught in school. It's called the Ukraine.
Well, it was the Ukraine up until 1991.
Yes, it was. And now it's just Ukraine.
That's
and
right.
So to watch these Republicans sit there, and once again, I don't know if they're doing it on purpose or they're just stupid, But the reality is every single time they put the, and you don't call it the France, you don't call it the Germany, and every time they do that, it's really insulting to the people of Ukraine, and I wish they would just stop.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm guessing, Will, and I've even referred to it a few times on the air as the Ukraine, and it's a hard habit to break when you spent the first X years of your life, calling it the Ukraine. But and I'm guessing that the Republicans, I mean, they love to insult the Democratic Party by calling it the Democrat Party, with emphasis on rat, to quote Joe McCarthy. But I doubt that they're intentionally insulting Ukraine. I think that what you're seeing is a symptom of how little regard they hold this entire process. How little they're paying attention.
I agree.
Yeah. Will, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back. It's 49 minutes past the hour. In our special video for our supporters,
Trump's comments send wrong message. So the very month you're over there as our ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Charlie writes that op-ed, and it wasn't just that attack, as Mr. Castor got into earlier. It wasn't just that attack on the president. We had former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who criticized candidate Trump. We had Mr. Avakov. I believe earlier you said, Ambassador, that Mr. Avakov was the individual who first alerted you to the efforts of Mr. Giuliani. Mr. Avakov, back during this same time period in the months just prior to the 2016 election, called then candidate Trump all kinds of names, called him a terrorist. And of course, we have Mr. Lushenko, a member of parliament, who was a source for Fusion GPS and the now somewhat famous dossier that flowed from Fusion's work. He said this in the Financial Times again in August of 2016 when you first arrived in Ukraine. He said this: the majority of Ukrainians.
My apologies to our callers who are on hold. Apparently the 5-minute break was actually a 5-minute break. And right now,
several high-ranking officials
Jim Jordan, the guy who is
the Ukrainian government,
typically half-dressed,
President Poroshenko was president of Ukraine.
He's got to just check out his history. Anyhow, he's going to see how fast he can talk at Ambassador Yovanovitch. Here
But I want to know, Ambassador, when this was all happening, did you go talk to anyone in the Ukrainian government about this? Did you go say to some of these officials, hey, you guys need to knock this off, this perception that we got? As Mr. Lushenko said, the majority of Ukrainian politicians on Hillary Clinton's side, that's not good. Did you have that conversation?
No.
This is another variation on the, how did you let yourself get into this situation, Ambassador?
Didn't alert anyone in the government?
Line of questioning.
No.
Well, one of the things we've heard so much over the last 6 weeks in depositions and frankly in the hearing on Wednesday is how important bipartisan support is for Ukraine. Democrats and Republicans agree they want to help Ukraine. In fact, the Democrats' first witness, their star witness on Wednesday, Mr. Taylor said Ukraine's most important strategic asset is this bipartisan support. And you would agree with that, right?
I do.
He said this in his testimony on Wednesday. On September 11th, I learned that the hold had been lifted the next day. Ambassador Taylor said, I conveyed this news to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian foreign minister.
That was 2 days after the whistleblower came out.
The high strategic value
what a surprise.
Of bipartisan support for Ukraine and the importance of not getting involved in other countries' elections.
Jordan will announce that.
So what I'm wondering is, this is the day after the aid's been lifted that Ambassador Taylor made this statement to the Ukrainian government. And he makes this after there's nothing been done by Ukraine to influence our election. Because President Zelensky didn't announce he was doing an investigation and the aid was lifted.
No, but he
felt he needed to say that. But in 2016,
planning on going on Fareed Zakaria's show and announcing the investigation.
That the majority of Ukrainian politicians want Clinton to win, because it was said by a member of parliament when the ambassador to the United States from Ukraine writes an op-ed criticizing then candidate Trump, when Mr. Avakov calls candidate Trump all kinds of names, nobody goes and talks to us and tells him
this is all for Fox News.
Knock it off. Did you have any conversations, Ambassador, with
Jordan is doing here?
Victoria Nuland or Secretary of State Perry about what was going on in 2016 and this majority of Ukrainian politicians being for candidate Clinton and not and opposed to President Trump?
No, I did not.
No one did anything.
She's
No one did
basically
anything.
tolerating
You
this.
see why maybe the president was a little concerned about what went on in Ukraine? And you couple that with the corruption level that we know exists in Ukraine, you add to that this idea that he's not a big fan of foreign aid, why he might be a little concerned about sending the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine?
I'm sorry, is there a question there?
There was.
Okay. Could you repeat it, please?
I'm asking.
Time of the gentleman's expired, but I'll allow you to repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm asking, maybe we can kind of see why the president was a little concerned when you have the highest ranking officials in the government.
That's not a question,
the
that's a
ambassador
rant.
criticizing him. Parliamentary member Lashchenko criticizing him.
Here he goes.
When you have
Here he
Avakov,
goes.
the guy who first told you about Giuliani, criticizing him. All this going on, and when you couple that with the concerns he has about corruption, the concerns he has about Europe not doing enough, the concerns he has about reluctance to send in the hard-earned tax dollars to any country.
Jordan, I have indulged you with extra time, but
I appreciate
my indulgence is wearing out.
I appreciate it.
There is a question here, right?
Our indulgence wore out with you a long time ago, Mr. Chairman. I'll tell you that.
I'm about to gavel you down, so if you have a question, I suggest you.
I'm asking her: do you think there's maybe a reason that this was that President Trump's concern was justified?
You know, I can't speak for the president on this, but what I would say is you've listed a number of actions. I think from my point of view, that doesn't create a Ukrainian government strategy to interfere in our election.
I didn't say that.
Mr. Jordan, please allow the ambassador to answer the question.
So I would just say that, you know, U.S. politicians will often criticize policies of foreign counterparts, even perhaps during their elections. You know, this happens in politics, and I think that it doesn't necessarily constitute interference.
Would you ever write an op-ed critical of a
expired.
presidential candidate in Ukraine?
Jordan, your time has expired. Mr. Welch, you're recognized.
Thank you.
This is Peter Welch, the Democrat from Vermont.
Like everybody here, I'm extraordinarily grateful to you for your career of public service, and I feel very badly about what you've had to endure. Like your colleagues, you don't complain.
Well, the testimony is going to continue with Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who Donald Trump today tried witness intimidation, actually trash-talked her on Twitter, and she's got to be concerned now that she's going to walk out of there and there's going to be, you know, right-wing crazies with guns and things looking for her. I mean, you know, Christine Blasey Ford is still hiding out. So anyway, we'll be back on Monday. Congressman Ro Khanna will be with us for an hour taking your calls, and we'll continue our conversation about this then. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It needs you. Tag, you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.